Hello everybody and welcome to Round Glass Review. I have an assertive lens review schedule for this year, so let's get these going out the door. Today we're going to take a look at the 7Artisans 35mm f1.2 photoelectric version 1 APS-C and micro four thirds manual focus lens. Let's jump right in here with 7Artisans. To the best of my knowledge, they are the brand. I don't believe that they are actually doing the manufacturing. Whether or not they're doing the design, I couldn't figure out based on what I could find online. So, however they're designing or building these, I suspect that either they outsource the manufacturing or the brand itself is owned by a manufacturer. There's some speculation here because there's a lot of difficult to ascertain information with the companies that are based in China in the lens manufacturing industry. So, who is it that actually makes these lenses? Well, I'm going to speculate again, and this is based on the incredibly near to basically identical design of a different lens, the 7Artisans 25mm 0.95, that is also listed on the website for a company called Anbans for a brand called Tiase, T-I-A-S-E. The company name on their website is the Fuzhou Anbans Photonics Tech Company, and it appears that they make at least some of the 7Artisans lenses. I was unable to confirm if this lens is in their catalog, and also just as a sidebar, I have no issue with lens makers subcontracting out the manufacturer. That's just fine. I think that's probably that's the way a lot of things are made, and there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. So I don't want you to interpret me saying that I think that's what's going on as me saying that's a problem, because I don't think there is a problem with that. Anyway, the version 1 lens, which is what we're talking about in this video, because version 2 has a much different optical design than this lens. This lens was released on 24 July 2019. I couldn't verify if it's still in production or if everything that's being sold right now is just new old stock. The second version of this lens, which is not discussed in this review, that second version arrived in Amazon's catalog on 10 December 2020. So typically, this lens would be considered an ultra-fast walk-around lens for an APS-C camera. As an APS-C lens, in full-frame terms, this lens functions like a 50mm. So if you're new to this series, let me just tell you that there won't be any test charts or situations that intentionally set this lens up to succeed or fail. These reviews are based on real-world use and aim to provide images and, where applicable, video to mimic how you're actually likely to use this lens. And yes, there is video in this video because this is a lens which is really well designed for video use. Focal length and angle of view on this for APS-C. It's a 35mm focal length with a 46-degree angle of view. Now, I could not find the numbers for that for micro four thirds, so I went about calculating it, and this would function approximately like a 46mm lens with a 52-degree angle of view in APS-C terms on micro four thirds. So basically what I mean by that is when you use this on micro four thirds, you have a crop factor coming down from APS-C, so you're losing some of the image periphery. There's an advantage to that because you're also losing a lot of the softness at the wider apertures. You're also going to lose a lot of the field curvature that's in that part of the image. The aperture range is marked at 1.2 to 16, and I specify that it's marked because there appears to be some variability in how accurate those markings are. We'll get to that in the tips section, but I did not find the markings to be. They are more accurate than other lenses in this class, but they are not what I would call accurate. The filter size is 43mm, the closest focus is 35 centimeters. It is manual focus only, and it is available for Sony E, Fuji X, and micro four thirds mounts. I use this exclusively per normal on Sony E because I don't have Fuji X or micro four thirds cameras or lenses. Primarily, I used this lens on the A6400, but there are also a number of stills, no video, in this video that were taken on the A5000 and the NEX C3. I think that's the one that I have. And this lens weighs 175 grams. The best use tip that I have for you is this. Ignore your camera's focus peaking and learn to focus with this lens using manual focus assist zoom. That's where you zoom in on your screen to fine-tune your manual focus. If you don't know how to use that, you'll want to learn how to use that before you get into this lens. And the reason is that this lens is soft enough, especially on the wider apertures, that in every camera I used, I received incorrect focus peaking highlights. Also, this lens has some pretty significant field curvature in places, and that field curvature does not help your camera's focus peaking, and both of those things combined, the softness and the curvature, added up to every camera I used this lens on, giving me false focus peaking readings. So if you're going to use this lens, what you want to do is zoom in on the spot that you want to have in precise focus, and as soon as you have that in focus, take your picture. The next tip I have for you is to use your camera in AV mode. Then what you want to do to adjust your exposure is do that with exposure value compensation if you want to intentionally over or underexpose, for instance, and otherwise just let your camera do the thinking for you. It's how all of the makers with these types of lenses are designing them to be used, and it really is the best way. My next tip is to ignore the lens's aperture and focus scales and shoot based solely on what looks good in your live view. Another point is that this lens in general is very good as a walk-around lens, and that means it's going to handle most subjects well. I find that it delivers the most pleasing images when your subject is within 5 feet of you and you shoot at f/6 and wider. That really does seem to be this lens's sweet spot. However, it's also really good at landscapes, and that's going to be where you're stopped down from f8 and smaller and focused at infinity, and it handles those pretty decently as well. One last point, this lens is noticeably softer when you focus close when you're at a wide open to around f2.8 aperture. If you're comfortable with that softness, and if you're comfortable being very close to your subject and very careful with precise focus, then this lens can work really well wide open up close. I find this lens design fascinating. So I believe this to be a sonar-derived design based on the specific element shapes and the heavy bias of the positive elements forward of the aperture, and so I looked into other sonar designs. In this lens design, it could use the old Nikkor S 8.5cm f1.5's ID to get into bars. That's how similar the designs look. And hey, coincidentally, that Nikkor, it's a sonar design. This lens, however, opts for air-spaced elements in 2 places where the Nikkor did not. That said, sample photos online of that Nikkor, none of which appear in this video, illustrate performance characteristics, especially in terms of out-of-focus areas and flare, that bear a striking resemblance to the way that this lens performs. That should help explain why this lens is so fast and performs like it does, and honestly, is also a pretty decent portrait lens if you have a subject who is comfortable with you being close to them. And the sonar design, being a classic vintage lens design, does go a long way to explaining why it is that this lens delivers images that look classic and vintage, and why the handling and performance feel classic and vintage. And yes, one more note, I probably did mispronounce sonar, and that's because I've only ever read it in books. As a general statement, this lens will accommodate videography in line with the lens's performance profile, which I know is a ridiculous statement to say because that's true of every lens. What I mean by that is that what you see from this lens in the still images is going to translate pretty well into what you're going to get in the moving images. That said, performance, I find, is a bit better with videography than still imagery, and that owes to the frame rate and the way that a slight softness in your video lenses can complement a movement within your frame, or if you're photographing people, can really do them some favors as well. But let's look at some of the technical aspects of this lens for videography, and we're going to start with breathing. Breathing is tested here in this video a little bit differently than usual because I wanted to show how breathing behaves in a more realistic scenario than what I usually do. And that's to say that here I'm focusing from the closest focus point of the lens to about 2 meters away as opposed to about infinity away. In these still images, what I want you to do is note that the blue robot that's in the front, and note the way that the magnification affects him the most. So here I'm going to switch between the first and the fourth photo. There's 4 photos in the series, each one of which focuses first on the blue robot, then the red robot, then the silver robot that wants to give them a hug, and then the big wooden art figure that wants to give all of them a hug. What I'm going to do is I'm switching here between the blue robot and the art figure, and you can see, I think, pretty drastically how the blue robot's magnification changes, but it changes much more so in the lower portions. So what's happening is that the lower portion of the blue robot is being compressed. The breathing is functioning differently around the perimeter of the image than in the center of the image. And that's especially true for close-up subjects. This effect that you're seeing also changes the proportions of the red robot, though not as much. And there's 2 reasons for that. 1, the red robot is closer to the center of the frame, and 2, it's slightly further away. All of that said, breathing with this lens should be less noticeable when using human subjects, even at close-up distances, because those distances are still further than closest focus. Breathing will, however, affect your scene, and before you use this lens for real, you will want to test the way that it performs using focus changes mid-shot to see how that breathing is going to adjust the look of your scene. The lens aperture is stepless, which means that it doesn't have a detent for any of the stops. There's a hard stop at 1, 2, and a hard stop at the marked 16. That stepless aperture means it's ideal for video because you're able now to scroll through the entire aperture in an analog manner across the whole range. This lets you control the depth of field and exposure very smoothly. Now, one note on this. Just the way that the lens is designed, the smaller stops are more closely bunched together at their side of the aperture range. So it's very easy to move through the aperture with your ISO on your camera set to auto and then maintain a proper exposure from f1.2 to around f4.5, maybe even f5.6 if you have really good hand control. However, beyond f5.6, the stops of 8 and 16 arrive so quickly that if you use the same aperture control speed to get through that end of the range as you do when you're closer to wide open, the speed of the closing aperture increases so much that it will close faster than your camera may be able to keep up with your ISO adjustment. And that's going to cause you to have uneven exposure if you're going through that part of the aperture range to stop down or open back up, and noticeably uneven. So as a note here to 7Artisans, this has been the case in all of your lenses that I've tried, and it's annoying. A major improvement that you guys could do with your next generation of lenses to really improve them for videographers, and we know that this can be done because vintage lenses have this feature, is to have the aperture ring transition from stop to stop at even spacing across the entire aperture range. So with this lens, the distance between f1.2 and f2.0 is far greater than the range from f5.6 to f16. Whereas if all of the aperture settings, all of the stops, were spaced evenly, it would be much easier to control the stop down to achieve even exposure as the aperture is opened and closed. The front element on this lens is non-rotating, but it does move in and out, but only about 1 centimeter, maybe 2. So the movement on that is pretty minimal. Focus throw is 135 degrees according to my protractor. The focus ring is stationary, so if you have, and what I mean by stationary is it does not move in and out. And what that means for you in videography is that if you have a way to connect this lens to a focus motor, it can be automatically focused more easily. The ring itself has pronounced and easily held geometry, which does make it quite easy to use if you're just using your hands, either in video or just to focus for stills. The focus ring and mechanism are very well designed. Focus damping is good in that there's minimal resistance, but focus holds. That said, the focus ring on mine has broken in quite a bit in the last year or so as I've been using it, and the focus is much smoother now, but it's also a little bit less resistive than when the lens was new. As a benefit, the focus ring has no play in it at all. When the focus ring starts moving, the focus starts adjusting. And again, that owes to a very good mechanical design on this lens. Mount stability is exceptional, and you will not have this lens shake or move and thereby cause stutters in your video when you focus or adjust the aperture during a shot. If anything, quite honestly, the mount on this lens is a little bit too solid, and sometimes this lens can be really, really tough to remove from a camera. For sharpness, if you share your images on the social medias, it's probably going to be fine. Actually, it's definitely going to be fine. This lens can really print images fairly well. This is a good lens. Anyway, if you're printing up to around ledger size, and you put enough megapixels behind this lens, it's going to deliver results. It's going to be okay. If you want to print a poster or a billboard and look at them up close, way closer than they should be, this lens is not going to be the best choice for you. But it can print fairly large images up to poster size if you view them from an appropriate viewing distance. Here's the best advice I have for you with any lens, and it goes for this one as well, but it goes even more so for other inexpensive lenses. Stop pixel peeping. Pixel level sharpness is a ridiculous standard because the variations in sensors, even between identical sensors in different cameras of the same model, and camera production tolerances, especially in the way that flanges are spaced away from their sensors, means that lenses will perform differently on different cameras. The same lens will perform differently on two different cameras of the same model. So for sharpness, this lens renders eyelashes in sharp outline, eyes with very good detail, and it's still soft enough at the wider apertures not to call out every single skin flaw and blemish like an auctioneer verifying a bid. I can't believe I'm writing this sentence right now to read out loud later, but what I just said means that this lens does exactly what top-notch portrait lenses should do. For build quality, it's good. It's very good. It's built better than many substantially more expensive lenses that I've used. The press-on cap fits beautifully, and it stays in place well, even after like 18 months of significant use and carrying around this lens. I have one build quality complaint. It's kind of insignificant, but the knurling on this lens feels a bit sharp on the finished edges. I mean, you're not going to cut your fingers. It just doesn't feel quite as well finished as, other lenses that are more expensive. Not a major complaint. In terms of image contrast, it's good. Like, there's a lot of contrast built into these images. There's not a whole lot that you're going to have to do in post with this lens in terms of your contrast and sharpness. And sharpness, by the way, is just contrast. This also means, by the way, the contrast performance of this lens, that you will really be able to use it well under even lighting, especially overcast days where it delivers very good contrast and colors. For your aperture shape and blade count, this has 9 aperture blades, and they are suitably circular from wide open until around f4-ish. Now, as a note and a personal preference, I like odd-numbered aperture blades in a lens because they make double the number of the aperture blades of points on source lights in nighttime images. I know that's a weird thing to be persnickety about. Anyway, this lens's aperture does a very good job in the range where you should be using this lens, which is f2 to f5.6, of keeping the out of focus areas controlled and the aperture generally circular. But let's talk a little bit more about the out of focus areas, because there is quite the lengthy paragraph here in my script. All right, so wide open, out of focus area quality will be divisive. And wide open, the images from this have that characteristic bright ring on out of focus area light points that many people call bubbles. A very grating term. Basically, let's spend some time here. Historically, lens makers, every lens maker has bent heaven and earth to make out of focus areas that did not deliver source point light blurs with bright perimeters. Why? Well, because with a chaotic and bright background, the overlapping bright circles make the blurry areas look like the visual embodiment of a madman's chaotic and rambling manifesto. As I understand these focus points today, basically what's happening is that light rays are being bunched more at the edges of the circles of confusion than in the centers. And that's backed up, by the way, that theory, that with this lens, you get the bubble type, the bright circle perimeter around the blurry area out of focus points when you are focusing close to have a subject you're focusing close to and source points behind them. When you are focused at infinity and have source points close to the lens, the out of focus area light points are much more evenly illuminated and just take on a bit of image coma, especially towards the edge of the frame. So when you have those circles with the bright perimeters, if you imagine that these bright lines, think of the circles not as the center parts of them, just as those very bright perimeters, and now overlap them over and over in your mind. If you picture those bright lines overlapping and overlapping infinite numbers of times, that's going to lead to that chaotic and blurry background or out of focus area. And that's why lenses have been designed for decades to have circles of confusion with brighter centers than peripheries. Circles of confusion that blend together smoothly because the center of them is brighter than the perimeter, create smooth out of focus areas. This out of focus area function, the bright perimeters in this lens, it's just baked into the design. In fact, I thought, hey, maybe this problem is just because the lens elements aren't painted black on their peripheries, on their edges. So I disassembled this lens, and in fact, all but one of the individual lens elements were painted on their perimeters, and some of them on the backs with where the light doesn't pass through, with a very dark, thick black coating. And it's like a really good high quality black finish. But just to prove that I was in fact wrong with my theory, I painted the periphery of the one element that wasn't painted. I painted it a very matte black using black 2.0 paint. And because of course I did that. And then I took a set of shots before I did that. I took a set of shots afterwards, and there was zero change in performance. So this flaw, the bright perimeters, is just part of the optical design, and frankly, better work could be done on that. So lecture meets sermon over. Let's move on. One last point before we do. The worst offending blurry areas, as I mentioned, are when you have a subject at close focus and source points behind it. So if you want to avoid that look, don't meet those criteria with your photos. If you really do want to have blurry and chaotic out of focus areas behind your subjects, what you want to do is put your subject as close as possible to the minimum focus distance of the lens and a bunch of bright individual source point lights as far behind them as possible, and that will give you that chaotic background look. In terms of design flaws, aside from the one that I just sermonized on literally for 6 minutes, I did not find that the focus scales on my lens and the focus indication points, and quite frankly, though to a much lesser degree, the aperture markings, to be as reliable as I would have liked. So those are improvements 7Artisans should make in future lens designs across their product range, because this isn't the only 7Artisans lens I have, and it's not the only one that has this issue. In fact, the other one I'm shooting with off and on right now doesn't even focus to infinity. Anyway, sidebar over. I will say that 7Artisans, of all of the different brands and lenses coming out of the Chinese production market that I've used, is doing the best job of marking their apertures, focus scales, and distance markings. And that's great. And it indicates that they can do better, and they definitely should. One other design flaw I want to talk about, and none of the other 35mm f1.2 lenses that I've tried have done this. In automatic photo processing operations with Photoshop, and I'm using CS6, there are functions, specifically auto color and auto tone, and both of them as a baseline are not great ideas to use in the first place. But with those automatic functions, if you use them, this lens's images can, they don't always, but they can and often do, turn this like plasticky or clayey tone. Just something about them dies with those automatic functions. And it's a look that I greatly dislike, and there are a handful of images that in this review right now actually that show that. My tip to you is to avoid doing auto color and auto tone corrections with these images from this lens, and if you're going to adjust any of that, do it with your curves. As for balance on the cameras, this lens is tiny, it's light. In fact, for heavy cameras like the A6400, it really feels unbalanced on the front. And it's not that the weight isn't distributed well, it is. It's just that it's so small, it's kind of hard for me to get my hand around the front of the A6400 to really grip it and get a good hold on it. That said, this lens feels really great on small and light cameras like the A5000. The 7Artisans 35mm f1.2 APS-C lens feels, in terms of handling and image rendering, like a vintage lens in the best of ways. It stands apart from other comparable spec lenses in the market because it is sharp, with bright and bold colors, and it creates a distinctive look that 7Artisans lenses, at least the ones I've used, provide. I would not call this a versatile lens in the sense that it's not going to do everything that you put in front of it really well. There are some things that it does very well, and there are some things that it just doesn't. Now, this lens does try to be versatile, and it is a good walk-around manual focus lens. But what it really does well is take portraits or take photos of subjects, which are up close, especially if you're shooting faster than f5.6. And that's where this lens is the best, up close and at large apertures. For many other uses, it's fine, but not superb. As a narrow landscape lens, it can work wonderfully, however. I find that it works best on drab or overcast days when the even lighting allows this lens's contrast to work really well, both on the scene's contrast and on the colors within the scene. But it also works in full sun for landscapes if you want to have a slightly more harsh and contrasty look. In either setting, it will also deliver fantastic tonal regression for distant parts of your scenes like mountains, and a lot of lenses don't do that. Now, it does, however, work best for landscapes when you're stopped down from f8 to f16 because anything wider than f8 really has too much softness for landscape work. As a sidebar, I do think that many of the landscapes I shot with this lens turned out very well, and in fact, some of the fall colors shots and things like that are one of the reasons I really came to like this lens. Its performance on landscapes did really change my opinion about it. Prior to using it for landscapes, I just was like, oh, it's an up-close portrait lens, and that's what it does. It's a one-trick pony, but no, it actually does well with a handful of different subjects, a small handful, and that means it can be a pretty serviceable walk-around lens. So back at the very beginning of this video, I said, this lens works like a fast 50mm lens in full frame terms. I think I said that. Anyway, if I didn't say it, pretend that I did. And I also noted earlier that it delivers results like a vintage lens. I think I've said that twice, and because it bears repeating. And if you like that image look, and if you like that image handling, well, you know what? This lens is worth looking at, because even though it has some flaws that I think other comparable lenses being made today don't have, I will say the images I captured with the 7Artisans 35mm f1.2 captivate me, and they keep my attention far more than those with any other of the 35mm f1.2 lenses that I've used. So this is not a lens that's particularly easy to use, in that you do need to get to know some of its quirks, especially the way that the out-of-focus area characteristics change, whether they're in front of or behind a subject, how they change with your focus distance, how your aperture affects blurriness and softness, and so on and so forth, and which apertures and focus distances work better and worse for different subjects. However, if you have or get this lens, and if you learn to use it well, I do think it will deliver the results you want well and fairly consistently.